Those questions are so articulate that I don't know that the paper is going to live up to the expectations that you've set for everyone. But thank you, Eric, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks as well to Libby Otto and everyone at the Humanities Institute for arranging scholars at Hallwalls. It's been a terrific series, and as I look at the lineup for this year, it's a real privilege to have followed Andy Dahm on Alexander von Humboldt, Marion Werner on the neoliberal age in Latin America, and of course Walt Hakala with his really intriguing discussion of dictionaries in colonial India. Eric mentioned the broader title. This is a book manuscript in progress. It's pretty near the end at this point. And to give you just some brief frame of what I'm doing for this particular talk, and because I've had the privilege of having a semester of course release with limited obligations to students, I thought now is the time finally to really put together all of the work that would go into the introduction of the book. And so while for September 11th, 2011, I gave a lecture at SUNY Fredonia that was just about Falling Man. There are, in fact, chapters on that book, DeLillo's Cosmopolis, Pynchon's Against the Day, and now I'm adding some material from Bleeding Edge. John Coetzee's Diary of a Bad Year. There will be a final chapter on Orhan Pamuk's Snow, which is about suicides of headscarf girls in a small town in eastern Anatolia province, and then probably a conclusion that will look at some very contemporary issues, including work by Zadie Smith. So what I've tried to do is to sort of carve out 40 or 50 minutes of what is probably 3 times the length in terms of an introduction. And I'm just calling this the subtitle descriptively, Transnational Politics and the Post-9/11 Novel. Disastrous provocations, innovative war machines, literary interventions. Each follows the other in turn. Excellent. The RMS Lusitania, with her revolutionary turbines capable of speeds in excess of 25 knots, is nonetheless torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1915 in a demonstration of the novel facility of submarine warfare. The loss of 1,195 civilian passengers and crew in contravention of the rules of naval warfare among nation-states contributes to the entrance of a largely isolationist United States into the First World War in 1917. Some, however, contend that its illicit cargo of war material is a conspiracy meant to draw America into the conflict. The devastations wrought by industrial modernity are partly responsible for Hemingway's declaration in A Farewell to Arms that the noble words, sacrifice, glorious, sacred, had become an embarrassment. And as he had volunteered for the ostensibly neutral ambulance field service, his protagonist sues for, famously, a separate peace, beyond national allegiance. The USS Arizona is the most spectacular casualty of the surprise assault by Japanese naval aircraft on December 7th, 1941, killing 1,177 American servicemen on the ship, despite 9 official government inquiries between 1941, and I was surprised to read this, as recently as 1995. The belief that U.S. officials had advanced knowledge of the attack courtesy of the decryption of secret Japanese military codes persists. In either case, the formation of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in June 1942 is a direct result of America's abrupt entry into the Second World War. As German media theorist Friedrich Hitler puts it, quote, war spawns most technological interventions, and real wars are not fought for people or for fatherlands, but take place between different media, information technologies, and, he might have added, surveillance agencies. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 expresses not only the absurdity and existential despair experienced by the Allied bombers in 1943, but also that of the mutually assured destruction, MAD, of the Cold War at the time of its publication. We were all crazy then, but there was no neutral country where we might follow Yossarian to avoid a nuclear conflagration. 19 hijackers who were covert members of the Islamist militant organization Al-Qaeda would board 4 commercial aircraft on the morning of September 11, 2001, and turned them into jet fuel-laden missiles aimed at highly symbolic targets of the New World Order, of economic, military, and political might, the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and the US Capitol. The tools of global jihad that were assembled on that day by an exiled heir to the Saudi bin Laden engineering conglomerate were asymmetrical warfare and mass murder of civilians, all considered apostate kafir regardless of nationality, with the goal of reestablishing a transnational Islamic caliphate on, not coincidentally, oil-soaked sands. This terrorist provocation had the strategy of drawing the world's remaining superpower into an economically and politically draining campaign, not unlike the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, which would destabilize the regime. And so it came to pass that the war on terror, with its suspension of habeas corpus for prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, with its extraordinary rendition or extrajudicial transfer of suspected militants through black sites operated by the CIA in 54 countries, with the use of torture or enhanced interrogation. That's the sort of political euphemism that George Orwell in Politics of the English Language regarded as a sign of civilization's general collapse. With the surveillance of private communication domestically and internationally under the irony-laden acronym USA Patriot Act, all of this has, if not toppled the Union, then severely eroded the democratic freedoms that bin Laden targeted in what he regarded as a genuine clash of civilizations. The Plot Against America, to catch the title of Philip Roth's political allegory, an alternative history of the 1940 presidential election, in which the pro-fascist Charles Lindbergh comes to power. Lindbergh was a primary candidate, was so ingenious and unprecedented that it naturally spawned its own conspiracy theories of, for example, controlled demolition, neoconservative cabals, revealed the failure of intelligence agencies to communicate across jurisdiction, and should have inspired, but didn't, incredulity with respect to yellowcake or uranium, and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that failed to materialize. Osama bin Laden's death notwithstanding, more al-Qaeda militants and some larger number of Pakistani, Afghani, and Yemeni bystanders have been dispatched by remotely piloted drone aircraft than conventional means. Al-Qaeda's asymmetrical tactics of suicide bombings and its disregard of human life remits an advanced technology of totally depersonalized cyber warfare. The literature of this global conflict may not differ in kind from its predecessors in its abrogation of national fealties, its deep skepticism of bureaucratic and sectarian legitimations of violence, and of course the dehumanization of warfare. Though Hemingway and Heller's now classic novels of the 20th century wars took a dozen and more years to be written after their author's experience, post-9/11 literature has appeared in the age of electronic media instantification, seemingly too soon after the events it describes. After all, Tolstoy in his novel of the Napoleonic War of 1812, War and Peace, published only 60 years after its historical setting, said that the book had been published in the days of our grandfathers. I'm sorry, that the book referred to events in the days of our grandfathers. Yet it's not a literature that speaks to the converted with platitudes or reassurances, but one that challenges virtually every cultural, political, and historical assumption held by its reader. To select one example, and there will be a few to follow, the half-Irish and half-Turkish writer Joseph O'Neill presents a Dutch-born equities analyst of large-cap oil and gas stocks, Hans van den Broek, investigating the death of a Trinidadian entrepreneur in New York, whilst estranged from his English wife Rachel in the novel Netherland. Having fled with their son to London to escape, quote, an ideologically diseased country whose masses and leaders suffered from extraordinary and self-righteous delusions, Rachel upbraids her husband, who has remained in New York, quote, Bush wants to attack Iraq as part of a right-wing plan to destroy international law and order as we know it and replace it with the global rule of American force. Tell me which part of that sentence is wrong and why. Unquote. So sufficiently cowed, the désengagé businessman in Hans admits that, quote, the imminent invasion of Iraq had stimulated an impressive and impassioned opinion in practically everybody I knew. For those under the age of 45, it seemed that world events had finally contrived a meaningful test of their capacity for conscientious political thought. Unquote. The attack on New York and the post-9/11 terror anxiety erode the narrative of their marriage, as indeed the world narrative of an unexamined accumulation of superfluous wealth and smug cultural exceptionalism collapses in a single day. Fractious political discourse via long-distance telephone displaces the pillow talk of marriage and domestic harmony. Though it frequently alludes to the fabrication of the American dream in The Great Gatsby, Netherland is not a novel of national identity, but of cultural migration. Kamraj, Chuck, Ramkissoon's espousal of cricket diplomacy. Chuck wants to create a cricket stadium on Long Island for international sporting events. His espousal of cricket diplomacy among the multinational immigrant community in New York provides a model for cross-cultural negotiation. A truly global post-colonial sport that offers, he says, a lesson in civility. The grassy grounds of a tolerant rather than militant civilization. Still, Chuck's unsolved death by drowning, hands bound in the Gowanus Canal, covers a criminal conspiracy that, like the events of 9/11, does not profit us to avenge. Literature after 9/11 is written in the shadow of no towers, as Art Spiegelman titled his oblong, folio-sized graphic novel. As the son of two Auschwitz survivors whose extraordinary story is chronicled in Maus, he once again finds himself, quote, on that fault line where world history and personal history collide. Spiegelman's expression of fear, anxiety, and dread as a proximate witness to the attack in Lower Manhattan, having rescued his daughter Nadja from her school and fled with thousands of others along the Esplanade across the Hudson River, is intensified by his pre-existing condition of post-traumatic stress disorder. In that, Spiegelman's book could be taken as a kind of concentrated example of the early nonfiction novels and films of 9/11 that put forward narratives of personal trauma and melancholy in response to the jagged gashes in the towers and in world history that the planes left. His notes of a heartbroken narcissist coping with issues of self-representation, as he observes in the side panel commentary. Maybe not quite as sharp as it could be, but are criticized as overly self-absorbed in the reviews of the published book. But in the Shadows of No Towers typically provides a graphic narrative of the turn in post-9/11 writing from personal trauma to political thought. What deterred the New York Times and the New Yorker, for which Spiegelman had been a contributing artist and for which his wife had been the art director. I think the cover of this book was used as a New Yorker cover, but none of its contents. None of it was published in either of those works. These were not images of 9/11 hysteria, but it was his critical, sarcastic, and conscientious objection to the Bush administration's militarism and, in the hands of Halliburton, the war profiteering. Against the country's patriotic gore in the invasion of Afghanistan and the run-up to the Iraq War, Spiegelman finds himself in probably the most controversial panel of this book, equally terrorized by Al-Qaeda and by his own government. He had not wanted to be a political cartoonist, he says, and draw angry caricatures of politicians, but it was in the international press of what Don Rumsfeld mockingly called Old Europe, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the UK, where he finds an outlet for political views that to him hardly seemed extreme. Given his family history as survivors of the Holocaust, as post-war refugees, Spiegelman was born in Stockholm, he had considered himself a rootless cosmopolitan, equally homeless anywhere on the planet. As a world citizen, more so than as a New Yorker, he had expected the attacks to help bring folks together, which ever so briefly in the immediate aftermath it did, as Le Monde declared on September 12th, "We are all Americans." But why, he asks in one of the final panels, did those provincial American flags have to sprout out of the embers of Ground Zero? Why not a globe? If No Towers offers a personal narrative of 9/11, it's one that documents the transformation of Spiegelman's artistic response from issues of psychic trauma to questions of transnational politics. On October 16, 2002, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution authorizing the use of military force against Iraq in a largely bipartisan vote. Though the Bush administration billed the Iraq War as a multinational endeavor of the coalition of the willing, it was in reality a parochial exercise of neoconservative score settling with the intent of remaking the Shiite countries of the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, most notably, with their oil reserves into the pro-Western protectorates that they had once been. Against this cynical expression of rapacity, under the guise of national defense, from chemical and nuclear weapons that Saddam Hussein did not possess, a truly transnational resistance, or a coalition of the unwilling, emerged. On February 15, 2003, coordinated anti-war protests were staged in over 60 cities worldwide, including the largest ever demonstration in London, drawing an estimated worldwide 6 to 10 million people to march in the streets. The transnational politics of resistance to military and economic hegemony figures in several post-9/11 novels. In O'Neill's Netherland, Rachel takes her son Jake to a rally in London, in Hyde Park, carrying a, quote, "not in my name" placard. In Don DeLillo's Falling Man, Leanne, Keith Newdecker's wife, walks with her son, Justin, and 500,000 others across Manhattan towards Union Square, quote, "a bright swarm of people, banners and posters, printed shirts, coffins draped in black." Ian McEwan's Saturday is set entirely on the day of the protests in London as the neurosurgeon Henry Perrone experiences a collision of local and global violence. Thinking himself a docile citizen watching Leviathan grow stronger, he engages in a kitchen debate regarding the impending war with his activist poet daughter, Daisy, fresh from Hyde Park. Quote, "For or against the war on terror, or the war in Iraq, for the termination of an odious tyrant and his crime family, for the ultimate weapons inspection, the opening of the torture prisons, locating the mass graves, the chance of liberty and prosperity, and a warning to other despots, or against the bombing of civilians, the inevitable refugees and famine, illegal international action, the wrath of Arab nations and the swelling of Al-Qaeda's ranks." Failing to reach consensus, father and daughter also failed to imagine the enormity of what would transpire after March 19th, 2003, the campaign of shock and awe in Iraq, though McEwen surely means us to set their conflicting opinions in the balance. The political fiction of the Cold War critiques the bilateral symmetry of the nation-state chessboard. Spassky on the left versus Fischer, plain black. Reykjavik, Iceland, 1972, with its counterbalance of powers, spheres of influence, nuclear paranoia. Remember that Ronald Reagan told Mikhail Gorbachev, "Dovraya na pravaraya." Trust, but verify. Counter-espionage, conspiracy. The nation-state willingly sacrifices its citizenry to secure dominance and control over its territory, natural resources, and political system, as the wars of the 20th century amply demonstrate. Jingoistic patriotism and ethno-linguistic identitarianism are the Kool-Aid that persuade the citizen pro patria mori. The post-9/11 novel examines, however, a multilateral complexity of transnational politics, a Rubik's Cube of issues that require adjudication across national, geographic, cultural, linguistic, religious, and racial borders. In the epic of globalization, these are conflicts that are unlikely to be resolved without the cross-cultural deliberation among diverse peoples willing to set aside sectarian interests. The transition from the nation-state to the globalized market state, according to Philip Bobbitt, who's a constitutional theorist, shifts the state's raison d'etre from protecting the welfare of the nation to maximizing the opportunity of its citizens, the chief appeal of free market capitalism. The right of the citizen to pursue such opportunity unmolested takes precedence over the protection of territory, national wealth, or any particular dynasty, class, religion, or ideology. While the nation-state was inclined to sacrifice its citizenry for territory, which is of course what you do in chess, right? You advance upon, you sacrifice it for position. However, the market state strives to securitize its citizenry as both client and consumer, concerned neither with geographic deterritorialization nor local cultures. It pursues an ever-expanding purchase on the market share of goods and services. It's thus a transnational entity. The millennial transition from a nation-state order to a market-state order that occurs between the Second Russian Revolution of 1991 and the Second Persian Gulf War of 2003 finds corresponding turns in literary political fiction. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, among other instances of the social protest novel, take their subject matter, characterization, narrative conflict from mostly domestic affairs: immigration, modernization, industrial labor and production, class, race. And though their political ideology, especially an affinity for socialism, draws upon this world stage, these works imagine for themselves the possibility of domestic political affect, that opinions, votes, the will of the people ultimately would be heard. Maybe not without the shedding of some blood, but short of an armed revolution. The post-9/11 novel, however, figures its narratological crisis in terms of transnational issues, most prominently globalization and terrorism, but also including human rights. Thinks of Rushdie's Shalimar, genocide. I can think of Dave Eggers' What is the What?, the autobiography of Valentino Acep-Dang, women's rights, Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran, migration, animal rights, John could see as Elizabeth Costello, environmentalism, freedom of expression, natural resources, HIV/AIDS, the offshoring of labor and capital, the decimation of ethnic cultures, indigenous peoples and languages, peace movements, anti-globalization movements, and others. More so than representations of the liberal subject or resolutions of an event-driven plot, these novels are structured by deliberations of the dissensus, in Jean-Francois Lyotard's sense of an incommensurable cultural and political difference that concerns a world citizenry. These works recognize, as many did on 9/11, that everything changed, and indeed, that the political order had already changed before American Airlines Flight 11 impacted the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. Writers closely associated with and expressive of a national identity nonetheless turn their gaze towards supranational ideas, patterns, concepts that are not limited to the definition of national character or the historical events that shape it. Rather, the palette draws on all the tints available in the global rainbow, advocating a cosmopolitan rather than parochial worldview. Mohsin Hamid's novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, is a monologue by a Princeton-educated Pakistani emigre who returns to Lahore after 9/11 to lecture in the classroom against American imperialism. The native Urdu-speaking Changes, or Changes, regales in post-colonial British English a nameless American, most likely a CIA operative, his melancholy story, and the novel leaves hanging whether the fundamentalist or the operative has set a murderous trap for the other, or possibly both. Having spent part of his childhood, that's Hamid, spent part of his childhood in the US, returning to the Lahore American School, graduating from Princeton and then Harvard Law, now a dual citizen of the UK and Pakistan, Hamid considers himself a, quote, transcontinental mongrel, a citizen of multiple cultures. What each of these writers has in common is transnational politics. They envision themselves not as nation-state citizens, but as non-state actors. Though it's a commonplace to think of writers as belonging to a tribe of their own, in their multi-ethnic characters, supranational ideas, transcontinental narratives, these writers emulate many, though perhaps not all, of the characteristic actors of transnationalism: the non-governmental organizations, supranational courts, international terrorist organizations, multinational corporations, social movements, criminal networks, and of course media networks and network culture. Notably, of all of these things, one can't find, of course, a unified ideology, neither reactionary nor progressive, liberal nor conservative, with the exception that all of these actors, in some fashion, are resistant to a nation-state hegemony. Returning to Don DeLillo, answering an interviewer's question about the role of the writer in the late 20th century, Don says, quote, "The writer is the person who stands outside society, independent of affiliation and independent of influence. The writer is the man or woman who automatically takes a stance against his or her government. There's so many temptations for American writers to become part of the system and part of the structure that now more than ever we have to resist. American writers ought to stand and live in the margins and be more dangerous. Writers in repressive societies are considered dangerous. That's why so many of them are in jail. A fellow book critic, and this actually happened in this room, after I think it was a reading by Lawrence Norfolk a couple of years ago. A fellow book critic said, "Well, what are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on post-9/11 literature." And he said, "Well, you know, all literature published after September 11th, 2001 could be classified as a post-9/11 novel." But beginning with Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections, which was inauspiciously released on September 15th, it's either an all-encompassing category, or I'll have to make some effort to hone the epithet, to define it a little bit more as a genre. In an essay published less than a month after the attacks, James Wood declared Franzen's big social novel laughably archival, surpassed by a cultural and political cataclysm that it could not have anticipated. But what Wood most deplores in the literature of that moment, what makes it most vulnerable, he says, to the return of history, is most what's needed in the post-9/11 novel. He gives some grudging respect to DeLillo, particularly his magnus opus, Underworld, as the contemporary model of an American social novel which, in its effort to, quote, document American history, to pin down an entire writhing culture, to be a great analyst of systems, crowds, paranoia, politics, to work on the biggest level possible. DeLillo has been woefully influential, he said, over a younger generation of immensely talented writers, including Franzen, Richard Powers, David Foster Wallace, Dave Eggers, Dana Spiotta, and fellow Brit Zadie Smith. Though DeLillo was once called, in a review of his JFK novel, Libra, the chief shaman of the paranoid school of American fiction, Wood designates him as a kind of Frankfurt School entertainer. Well, you know, Frankfurt School and entertainer don't seem to me terms somehow that go together. But, a cultural theorist fighting the culture with dialectical devilry. It's sort of like an Adorno superhero. For whom knowledge of the culture supersedes delving into individual consciousness. But the enormity of 9/11 would put an end to all that, Wood hopes, dissuading writers from an hysterical realism, which was the term that came out of that essay. Hysterical realism, of proliferating and dubious factuality that has insinuated itself like an invasive species in the true monocultural terrain of the novel. Namely, the 19th century fictions of human consciousness by Stendhal, Flaubert, Henry James, that explored deep subjectivity, often oblivious to whatever was happening outside the brownstone's window. Such introspective fiction that holds up the Stendhalian mirror to individual consciousness after 9/11 has been most subject to wandering in the abysm of psychic trauma, reflecting helplessly the new dark lights of the age. Ineffectually searching, in fact, for what DeLillo calls the counter-narrative to terror. Here's DeLillo in an essay he published shortly before Falling Man. The writer wants to understand what this day has done to us. Wood is especially harsh in his treatment of his compatriot Zadie Smith for her preference in the work of her contemporaries for knowing how the world works rather than telling how someone feels. In his catalog of hysterical realism, he cites Zadie Smith's debut novel, White Teeth, not the more recent N.W., and its pre-9/11 invention of a terrorist Islamic group based in North London with the silly acronym Kevin. He's to be excused, however, writing in October 2001, if he fails to appreciate how Smith appraises the disaffected multi-ethnic youth of working-class Kilburn in northwest London, how they can be enrolled in the keepers of the eternal and victorious Islamic nation. Her farcical, ironic, and yes, hysterically funny terrorist group rather poignantly anticipates how homegrown Islamic militants would bomb the London public transportation system, killing 56 people on 7/7/05. Responding to Wood a week later in the same publication, that's The Guardian, Smith observes that if, as DeLillo declared, the world narrative belongs to terrorists, its, quote, plot is horrendously simple. It has to do with things like faith, revenge, poverty, God, hatred. So what now? Does anyone want to know the networks behind those seeming simplicities? The paths that lead from September 11th back to Saudi Arabia and Palestine, then back to Israel, back further to the Second World War, back once more again to the First. Does anyone care what writers think about that? What is the counter-narrative of the post-9/11 novel? Or else, she asks, shall we sing of love and drawing rooms and earth and children and all that is small and furry and wounded? It does turn out to be worthwhile for the writer to want to understand that day, to want to know, and not just to feel, the network of things that underlay it. Because of the inadequacy of realism, to represent or to interpret the event, there has been an hysterical reaction to works of postmodern, or I would say post-9/11 culture, precisely because they eschew the stable referent and the necessity of political consensus. Leotard famously states that the postmodern would be that which, quote, puts forward the unpresentable in presentation itself, that which denies itself the solace of good forms, the consensus of taste, which would make it possible to share collectively the nostalgia for the unattainable, that which searches for new presentations, not in order to enjoy them, but in order to impart a stronger sense of the unpresentable. The post-9/11 novel shares with these postmodern works of culture three attributes. First, rather than fail to represent or interpret the event, it makes the ineffability, the polysemiety of the event its own subject or presentation. Second, rather than seek comfort in the respectful cloak of mourning and the decorous forms that acknowledge loss, it risks cultural, political, and moral censure on account of its affront to lukewarm public taste. And third, it recognizes that everything having been changed, only the formally inventive presentation will suffice to acknowledge the event's unpresentability. Post-9/11 fictions reject the consensus of taste and the fantasies of realism, both in their figural as well as their formal invention. The shock to the social order demands a shock to aesthetic decorum. A strong correlation exists between the figural and the formal affronts to the rules of literary genre and the social discourse by which consensus is established. Ken Kalfus's A Disorder Peculiar to the Country opens on 9/11 with a bitterly feuding couple that alternatively believes their detestable spouse has been dispatched in the attacks. Joyce Harriman regards from a distant rooftop the fact that her husband's office in the South Tower had just been removed whole from the face of the earth. She covered the lower part of her face to hide her fierce, protracted struggle against the emergence of a smile. Likewise, Marshall, having narrowly escaped the tower in the midst of falling debris and bodies, learns that his wife's flight, United 93 from Newark to San Francisco, which she has just missed, has crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Among, quote, the flood of refugees, filthy, dazed, grieved, bereft, he went nearly skipping over one of the East River bridges. Joyce's smile is a sign that black humor and political satire, rather than the gravitas of public memorial and oratory urging war, govern the novel's proceedings. Kalfus remarks in an interview that he had arrived at, quote, the grim observation in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks, at a time when, in our grief, we were glorifying the victims of the attacks, calling them heroes, as well as beloved, perfect husbands and wives. My view is that through cliché, we were dehumanizing the dead. Surely there must be some exceptions to the reverential remembrance of the victims, and more importantly, to the political consensus by which an aggrieved nation took military action against the evildoers. It was not my term, it was Bush's. His point in the novel is satirical, of course, a rebuff to our assumed national piety. The novel's chapters progress chronologically from September 2001 to March 2003, with a financially ruinous divorce between the couple and the war in Iraq looming. Marshall assembles a suicide vest from plans downloaded from the internet in Arabic. But when it fails to detonate in their Brooklyn Heights apartment, they're, of course, feuding over possession of the apartment, hard to come by resource. Joyce and the kids, ironically, help to troubleshoot the wiring, according to the diagram. Elsewhere, the drumbeat for war, from Colin Powell at the UN, Tony Blair before Parliament, Hillary Clinton in Congress, Leon Wieseltier in the New Republic, David Letterman on The Tonight Show, grows louder in, quote, the contempt for doubters. And then the novel, either because it's caught up with events or because of its utter disrespect for such mendacities, makes a proleptic leap into a fantasia in which Bush was right. In its alternative ending to the war on terror, Saddam Hussein is hanged by freedom-loving Iraqi forces. Weapons of mass destruction are discovered in large stockpiles, with the medium-range missiles to deliver them both to Israel and to Europe. This one strikes me as particularly appropriate. Bashar al-Assad flees Syria. Iranian women doff their shadors. Bin Laden is captured in Tora Bora along the Afghan-Pakistani border, and most likely, or most unlikely of all, the Harrimans over New York pizza reconcile at ground zero. The narratological shift into a counterfactual future arrives like shock and awe, obliterating the reader's conviction in the stability of the referent, at least insofar as it is represented in political forums and mass media. What's true is false. The formal rupture of the novel, its break with the mendacious assertions of realism, underlies its attack on the political discourse of consensus, in fact, a disorder peculiar to the country. Post-9/11 fictions not only refuse this consensus of good taste as social phenomena, but they also deny, in Lyotard's terms, the solace of good forms as autonomous artistic structures. Such hybrid works deliberately deform the generic structure of the novel because the unpresentability of the event by the conventional norms of realism demands it. Kalfas's Disorder offers a counterfactual, alternative history of the political aftermath of 9/11 and the Iraq War, while maintaining its biting critique, its satire of the pro-war media and such events as the bombing of the Frank Sinatra International Student Center cafeteria at Hebrew University on July 31st, 2002. As implausible as it sounds, you can look that up. There really is a Frank Sinatra International Center at Hebrew University, and it was bombed. Such novels succeed in merging political commentary with the artist's prerogative to create factitious worlds. DeLillo's Falling Man, which I wish we could talk about a lot more, maybe afterwards, employs a recursive structure that returns to the morning of September 11th slightly before it begins. And temporally, it ends before it begins, like a snare to catch up the reader repeatedly in a terroristic plot. Its plot. Hamid adopts the dramatic monologue for the reluctant fundamentalist, eschewing the constituent narrative of dialogism in the novel, as Mikhail Bakhtin demonstrates. And he leaves unresolved whether it's Changes who is planning to assassinate his American guest, or an American undercover agent who plans to terminate with extreme prejudice a militant university lecturer. Frederick Begbeda's Windows on the World oscillates between hyperrealism and metafiction, violating both the rules of good taste and narrative plausibility by presenting the fruitless struggles of a father, Carthew Yorston, and his two sons, like Laocoon and his sons, trapped in the eponymous restaurant on the 107th floor of the North Tower, with each chapter time-stamped from 8:30 a.m. to 10:29 a.m. And those chapters alternate with those narrated by a diegetic author, Frederick Bedbeda, who, breakfasting in the Cille de Paris restaurant on the 56th floor of the Tour Montparnasse, a year after the attacks, reflexively considers the impossibility of his literary enterprise. So I'll take Bedbeda's conclusion as the conclusion of my own talk here today, when he writes, quoting, "I truly don't know why I wrote this book. Perhaps because I couldn't see the point of speaking of anything else. What else is there to write? The only interesting subjects are those that are taboo. We must write what is forbidden. French literature has a long history of disobedience. Nowadays, books must go where television does not. Show the invisible, speak the unspeakable. It may be possible, it may be impossible, but that is its raison d'etre. Literature is a mission impossible." Thank you.